Welcome to the Equity Conscious Leader, a new generation equity podcast and YouTube channel where we chat with leaders about tangible system change and strategies to advance and sustain equity work in their organizations. Our conversations dive deep into the 6 dimensions of equity conscious leadership. So how do you lead with transformational system change for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Let's find out on this episode of the Equity Conscious Leader with your host and educational equity leader, Dr. Jag Lathan.
Welcome. Thank you so much, Miss Akilah Vazquez, for joining us on the Equity Conscious Leadership podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And I am Dr. Jag Lathan. And today we are talking about deep listening and dialogue. And one of the reasons why I'm just so eager to have this conversation with you and to learn from you is because of your life and your professional experience around deep listening. We believe at New Generation Equity that in order to really transform systems, in order to have and create liberated systems and systems of justice for all people, African American, Latino, Indigenous, women, children, then disabled people as well, then we need to listen in that process in order to understand what marginalized groups or what folks who haven't been served well, what they're experiencing and what they need.
Yeah.
And your experience kind of leads us to this place of this conversation around deep listening and dialogue. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself and your journey towards deep listening?
All right. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I didn't always know what that meant or how I was going to get here or how I got here initially. But when I think back to my education in that second semester of college, I took a Black psychology course with Dr. Laura Head, and she inspired me talking about the need for BIPOC professionals, psychologists, therapists, psychiatrists, that people need to see people like them in the room. And I left that class inspired, and my journey ultimately led me to being a therapist. And while I didn't start off as a therapist, my first job was at Alameda County Children and Family Services. So I was a social worker. I spent 17 years in that role. So my first 8 years, I was a child welfare worker, and so I supported families with reunification. I did a little bit of family maintenance, so when the children were able to go back home after they were reunified, I would, kind of follow them maybe 6 months or so to just make sure that they were able to stay home. Ultimately, I changed from being a child welfare worker to a child welfare supervisor. And in my role as a supervisor, I was over what we used to call the group homes unit, but we changed it to our independent living skills. So we worked with the 14 and a half, 15-year-old population until they were 21 years old. And so during the course of that time, I learned to support families, children, as well as train foster families, adoptive families, and relative caregivers. Mm-hmm. After about 15 years or so at the county, I had an opportunity. Well, I'll take it back just a little bit. And I'll talk more about this, but I had some coaching. The county had provided us with coaches to come in to talk about power and privilege. And during that time, I was seeing a coach, Dr. Abner Bowles, and he really supported and encouraged me to get out there to start really practicing therapy. He was
and
like,
this is while you were
this is while I was a social worker supervisor, yes. And so he said, just, start with 3 to 5 clients. And so I said, okay, because I was really nervous about, after being in social work for so long, I was like, okay. So I spent some time getting my skills up, feeling confident, and started my private practice really small. And then somehow my name, I guess, kind of got out there that I worked well with the millennial kind of population, but also that I had an understanding around trauma. And so I went on to work at a social media company it was temporary, but ultimately it became my primary work, as well as my private practice. And so that's where I am today in the world of psychology, providing resources and support around trauma, loss, depression, anxiety, which all comes back to listening.
So all comes back to listening, yeah. So we believe that in order to transform systems, people need to listen to each other, learn about the needs of people, and also share, right, about themselves. Talk to us about what listening means.
Yeah, so, there are probably over 20 types of listening skills, right? So, or I guess the phrasing around listening. So if you look at the word reflective, you can put reflective listening. You can say empathetic listening. You can say constructive listening, deep listening, right? So you put that adjective in front of that verb, you got an adverb. And so depending on the setting that you're in, you're going to need certain skills. So as a therapist, I'm often using therapeutic, empathetic, reflective listening. In an organization, you may use more deep listening, constructive listening. You should be using deep listening and reflective listening as well. So, like I said, lots of types of listening, and depending on the setting and who you're working with and what the goal is, you're going to get different outcomes.
Yeah. So tell us how and why this is important when you're thinking about kind of transformational change in an organization. What is the importance of listening? And do you have any examples from your years of experience around listening that you can share with us and how that made a difference?
Yeah. So to really make, change, right? Because there's going to be like a first level change, which is more on the surface, and, you kind of implement something and then it's kind of done. But if you want to make true deep or, systemic change, you want that second level change, which requires bringing in all the partners, those that are important to the community, the community partners, the different people within the system, to really interview them, survey them, and find out what's important, what the change needs to be. And so I would think that the example that I would like to use, and where I really learned about like power and privilege, was towards those last 5 years at the county. We implemented this power and privilege series. And so we learned about where our power comes from, how we show up in the room, what our privilege looks like, right? And so depending on who you are around your ethnicity, your gender, what your historical family, oppression, all that. Like if you think about that, that's how you show up in the room. And so for me, I didn't really think about like first generation college student, graduate, working on my doctorate, right? How I show up in the room with my clients, for example, even if we look the same, our experiences may not be the same, right? And so in order for them to get true listening from me, I have to learn to be quiet at times, right? And as a Black therapist, I don't look at myself in that traditional way that I, need to just always be quiet. I'm very engaging with my clients, right? So, but in an organization, if you want true change, there's a lot that comes with that, right? You are, one, looking at yourself and what you bring to the room. You're looking at the person who you're talking with or the people that you're talking with and what their experiences are. And so when we're talking about like deep listening, it's an internal but also external process. So, but we have to take that back, right? So at some point, how do we learn to listen?
And I would tell you, in my household, it was interesting, the different types of listening, right? And yeah, you're right. Then we bring that to the workplace. We bring that to our friendships or whatever.
Our relationships.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So, you think about what happened at home, right? Initially as kids, you're like, some homes were like, be quiet. We don't want to hear the kids in the home, right? You only listen, or you only speak when you're told to, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there are situations where you're encouraged to speak your truth. And that is the best type of relationship, right? Where you can be your authentic self. And so when you have that experience, and you go into an organization where you're used to being encouraged to speak, and then you're all of a sudden silenced, that's really doesn't feel safe, right? So the goal in any organization is to make sure that the people that we're listening to feel safe. One, that's the first part, psychological safety, right? The second part is, are we observing not just their words, but their body language, right? So, a lot of people often will say, oh, when they cross their arms, that means they're defensive. It could mean that, but it also may mean that that's their way of protecting themselves, right? So not thinking about it in the negative when we look at somebody's body language, but also just trying to be empathetic in understanding the whole person.
Mm-hmm. One of the kind of quotes that we have in our framework says, deep listening is data. By inverting our dominant approach to data and listening to the voices, narratives, and perspectives at the margins, we began to humanize the process of data gathering. And this is from Safir and Dugan. And then finally, deep listening is a gift. Deep listening requires humility, courage, and love. What comes up for you when you think about those things?
Yeah. So again, going back to that Power and Privilege series that we learned and we worked through, we talked about cultural humility. And I take that throughout all the work that I do. That is the perspective that I bring to the room anytime I'm engaging with someone, right? That I have to know what their experience is culturally. And culturally, again, that goes back to not just how they look on the outside, but what does that mean to them with their value system, with their belief system, right? What their norms are. And so when I think about the work that we did at the county, we did those kind of deep dives into bringing people into the room to help them teach others how to advocate for themselves, right?
Tell us more about that, because I know at one point we talked about advocacy groups. So like young advocates, youth advocates, parent advocates, or community advocates. Can you talk about that and what role listening played in that project, program, or
Yeah. So when it comes to the court system, right? Your children being removed from you, if we're using that as the example, most of the time you're not going to trust the other people in the room. And when we think about our listening skills, when you are not feeling safe, you can't be vulnerable. You aren't able to hear what is happening, right? Oftentimes we get so nervous that our ears will just shut off. And so when you have an advocate in the room, that advocate can be those ears for you, right? They aren't just your voice, but they also can hear those subtle nuances, those biases, because there's bias listening, right? That often happens in some of those systems. And so your advocate is listening on your behalf, but they are also being your advocate in the way that they can use their experience, their knowledge of the system to make change, right? So, ultimately the goal with an advocate is to model that behavior. And oftentimes we need that, right? As children, our parents hopefully modeled listening skills for us, but also being able to speak up and to speak your truth.